Okay, hi everybody. Sorry, we're a little late to get started. Welcome. I don't need that microphone. Actually, you know me. I'm Jeremy. I'm the director of the honors program, and I'm so pleased to welcome everyone here tonight for our second Art and Politics lecture series event of the season. Every month we have a lecture of some kind that touches on art, politics, and the complicated ties between them. We had Kate Gabriel read a book from her new book of poetry last month, and this month I'm so honored to possibly to welcome our possibly farthest traveling yet lecturer, which is Professor Renzo Aroni here behind me, who came here from Lima, Peru, to speak to us. I'll just say a tiny bit about kind of the impetus for this lecture, and then a little bit about our speaker, and then get out of the way. Honors juniors each year take a trip abroad, which many of the honors students know. Last year was supposed to be a trip to Peru for some of those students, but we canceled it due to the both the protests at the time that were engulfing the country and the incredible state repression that was happening at the time. The state, going into universities and randomly arresting students. The bloodshed on the streets. And so, those of us, some of us are going to Peru again this year, so that's good. But also, we wanted to use that as an opportunity to educate ourselves and each other about the political situation in Peru. And I can think of really no one better to do that than, and through an artistic lens, an aesthetic lens, than Professor Aroni. So forgive me, I'm really quickly just going to read a few biographical details because he deserves it. So he's an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, where he teaches courses on contemporary history, oral history, and the politics of memory. Before joining PUCP, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Society of Fellows in the Humanities and a lecturer at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. He has an MA in anthropology from the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City, and a PhD in Latin American history from the University of California, Davis, with an emphasis on indigenous studies and human rights. He's currently working on a book manuscript, Indigenous Peasants at War, Resistance and Massacre in Peru's Shining Path. He has multiple articles that have appeared in academic journals, such as Latin American Perspectives and the NACLA Report on the Americas. And he's currently he's a host of a podcast, Cuscala, a podcast about Quechua and Andean knowledge. And he's currently working on a new project, which you'll be hearing some about today, on music and resistance in Peru. So without further ado, and I'm going to send a sign-around sheet around. That's the last piece of business. So please sign in if you can. If you're not on our email list, just mark, and I'll make sure you get on there. So without further ado, let's please give a warm welcome to Professor Aroni.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for the kind introductions. And thank you also to the School of Visual Arts, particularly to the Honor program and the BFA Visual and Critical Studies for the invitations. And thank you all of you for being here. And what I'm going to present today, it's about the role of music in social movements and the state-sponsored violence and repressions, focusing on the massive indigenous peasant mobilizations from the southern Peruvian Andes to Lima, Peru's capital city, against President Dina Boluarte and her authoritarian government from the late 2020 to the early 2023, that caused more than 60 deaths, mainly indigenous Quechua and Aymara citizens, at the hands of police and armed forces. Quickly unexpected, the protests became massacres in Andean cities like Andahuaylas, Ayacucho, and Juliaca. As you will see in this map that shows where these tragic events, massacres happen in the southern Peruvian Andes, that's mainly populated by bilingual Quechua Spanish or Aymara Spanish speakers. And the people who were killed and during the protests were mainly, of course, indigenous descendants or indigenous themselves, being affected by this very brutal state violence. And I bring this quote from an Amnesty International report after this event that bring an evidence how repressive and brutal was this repressions. The evidence, as it indicates, that the police and the army fired bullets indiscriminately and in some cases at specific targets, killing or injuring bystanders, protesters, and those providing first aid to injured people. The political power of music that I'm going to talk about today is not limited to its ability to mobilize protest or address social and political subjects. It also creates or reinforces communities of mutually engaged participants, fostering protest, resistance, and activism beyond the physical spaces where demonstrations arise. For instance, using digital and social media and rural-urban community networks based on their cultural, political, and democratic practices. Since the demonstrations erupted in Peru in December 2022, dozens of musicians and singers have composed protest songs in different local and global musical genres, including hip-hop, rock, reggae, Quechua pop, Andean popular, huayno, and carnival, to voice their social and political discontent. The songs questions democracy, citizenship, racism, and state violence, particularly against historically marginalized indigenous people. They also address these songs about resistance and the struggle to exercise their political rights denied by mainstream politics, media, and conservative coalitions. By addressing the current political crisis in Peru through music protests, I will provide some historical context that goes back to the 1980-2000 Peruvian internal armed conflict between two guerrilla insurgent movements and the government, and how musicians responded to this era of violence, giving their testimonies through songs from that wartime and its present continuity. This democracy is no longer a democracy. Dina, murderer, the people repudiate you. How many deaths do you want for you to resign? Is the most popular protest anthem that has echoed across the many demonstrations from southern Peru to Lima, calling for the resignation of the new President Dina Boluarte. Dina Boluarte came to power on December 7, 2022, following her predecessor Pedro Castillo's failed self-coup, or as we say in Spanish, autogolpe. Boluarte will quickly receive support from right-wing sectors and the mainstream media because of her reciprocal support for conservatism and the ongoing neoliberal economic model. She then became the head of a coalition with a majority of right-wing Congress of Peru and the Peruvian armed forces, raising concerns about authoritarian civilian military government forming. As you can see in this slide, the timeline of these events that happened between late 2022 and the early of this year. What I'm talking about is when the former president Pedro Castillo was put out, and the protest erupted, and the response from the government, the reaction was very authoritarian, repressive, and causing these three massacres, major massacres in Andahuaylas in December 11 and 12, and in Ayacucho, the December 15 and 16, that killed about 10 civilians, mainly indigenous Quechua speakers, and some of them minors under 18 years old. And the last massacre in Juliaca, in southern region of Puno, where at least 18 civilians were killed during the clashes and protests. The right-wing coalitions, the right-wing sectors, and the mainstream media began to respond to this era of violence, giving their testimonies through songs from that wartime and its present continuity. This democracy is no longer a democracy. Dina, murderer, the people repudiate you. How many deaths do you want for you to resign? Is the most popular protest anthem that has echoed across the many demonstrations from southern Peru to Lima, calling for the resignation of the new President Dina Boluarte. includes 1990s former president and dictator Alberto Fujimori's daughter Keiko Fujimori political party, which has lost but not conceded the last general elections in 2021. As you see in this map, the elections main candidates were Keiko Fujimori and Pedro Castillo, in which Keiko Fujimori lost the elections. But Pedro Castillo's support, as you see in this map, the red color is the area where he gained the most support, mainly from rural provinces, and that who identify with him as he represented, like a rural union, and provincial people, like in most of the people who lives in the rural and provincial regions. So explain a little bit more context, how we ended up, in this tragedy of massacres and how repressive was this violence that go back to the 1980s, 1990s. The conservative and the media organizations never accepted that a rural union teachers defeated them and risked their privilege over controlling state power. The right-wing controlled Congress obstructed Castillo's government, attempting to remove him with consecutive impeachments for corruption allegations. Castillo attempted to dissolve Congress, claiming it constantly blocked his executive policies. However, the legislative body impeached Castillo immediately and removed him from office. Media critics reported Castillo's dramatic fall with these words, unquote, "He had breakfast as a president, lunch as a dictator, dinner as a detainee," unquote. Pedro Castillo was dictator for only 2 hours. Nowadays, Castillo shares the same prison with Alberto Fujimori, who was accused of series of misappropriation of public funds, abuse of power, corruption, and gruesome human rights abuses over a decade from 1980 to 2000, particularly when he gained total control after he staged a self-coup in 1992. His regime operated as a kleptocracy in 3 scopes: business, politics, and the military. In 2009, Fujimori was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his role in killings and kidnappings by the Grupo Colina Death Squad during his counterinsurgent campaign against 2 guerrilla groups, the Shining Path, or Sendero Luminoso, and the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, or MRTA for short. Since the removal of Castillo, the protests initially mobilized his supporters. Then it grew to a massive mobilization across the nation for broader demands, including a new general election that called for the resignation of Boluarte and the replacement of Congress members. They also claimed the installation of the Constitutional Assembly that can make a new constitution, different from the 1992's Fujimori's authoritarian and neoliberal constitution. The forming military-civil government reactions to the rising protests was a declaration of a nationwide state of emergency, deploying the army on the streets and suspending the right to gather and move freely. Demonstrators angered even more and took public spaces, local government offices, and regional airports. The escalation violence ended up with massacres. The government alleged that drug trafficking, illegal mining, criminal organizations, radical leftist groups, and even a neighboring country like Evo Morales' Bolivia financed these mobilizations. In reaction, Aymaras and Quechuas clarified that their self-managed communities supported it. The demonstrators decided to mobilize Lima to listen to and find social justice and justice for their victims after the massacres like in Ayacucho and Juliaca. They called this mobilization La Toma de Lima, or the takeover of Lima, as an indigenous woman declared in Quechua from Puno region. Manamyo haikuha pagashacho purisko. Dirichui kuta respitukuspa purisaiko. The word dirichui kuta, which means our rights, is the most powerful used in her speech during the massive mobilization of Aymara people, taking several buses to Lima. By saying dirichui kuta, she claims her rights to protest and stress their political rights. As she continues declaring, we ourselves are going on our own. No one is financing us. We will make ourselves respect and that they listen to our voices. We are not going to allow ourselves to be trampled like in the past. That is why we are fighting for our rights. Who is paying me? No one is paying me. We ourselves are traveling, organizing, abandoning our children, all because of this government. We are all just for this cause. We are all going to live, or we are all going to die, and we will all come to fight. We are traveling to enforce our rights, traveling with all our brothers and sisters. Unquote. In Peru, indigenous men and women do not have the rights to make politics. If they protest, it is because radical political actors manipulate and mobilize them. This paternalistic and racist vision of the elites shows their incapacity for understanding indigenous community politics. The worst part of this vision is that these privileged sectors denigrated those protesters, passing a law to criminalize them as terrorists or terrucos, linking them with the Maoist Shining Path terrorism. Dictatorial regimes under Alberto Fujimori in the 1990s and Dina Boluarte today criminalize protests with brutal repressions, arbitrary detentions and killings, and torturing and imprisoning grassroots leaders with the same anti-communist paranoia using the shadow of the Shining Path. At this time, I should give you a brief background on the Shining Path or Sendero Luminoso. That was the main topic of my research for many years. And I'm gonna give you briefly background on this era of violence from 1980 to 2000 in order to understand the continuity of this state violence and repressions and the use of this word terruco or terrorist, linking in order to delegitimize those who are demonstrating. The Shining Path arose in Ayacucho as a small splinter Maoist party in the 1960s that started its armed struggle in the village of Chuschi by burning ballot boxes on election day in May 1980, just as the country returned to democracy after 12 years of military dictatorships. From Ayacucho, it expanded, as you see in this map, in the southern part of the region, the dark yellow area, Ayacucho. From that region, it expanded across the Andes and lowland Amazon, from where it sought to encircle Lima and other cities by late 1980s and early 1990s. The party leaders were mainly educated, middle and upper class, mestizos from urban centers, while the rank and file members were indigenous descendants, laborers, and the leaders of this movement offered this local and rank and file members, combatants, an armed rebellion to take power, change economic disparities, and make an egalitarian society. The leaders also offered a gendered message for incorporating women in leadership and the rank and file members. However, women experienced also numerous barriers inside this movement, including patriarchy, misogyny, and sexual abuse by male guerrilla leaders. Women compose about 40% of Shining Path militants and 50% of its central committee, the top leadership. And as I said, even that discursively open the possibility that women can join this guerrilla insurgency, in practice, most of these women faced so much barriers and fighting for their own political liberation inside the movement, that they were making kind of internal revolution within this big revolution that was fighting against the system and bringing a world revolutions. So this is a very important part that I focus on my research, the gender perspective of this insurgency, that I can talk more later after the talk. Defeated in 1992 with the capture of Abimael Guzman, the top leader of the Shining Path in Lima, this movement declined rapidly in the following years. Former dictator Alberto Fujimori took credit for this military victory. However, his conviction on charges ranging from corruption, abuse of power, and human rights violations showed that the Rondas Campesinas, the community self-defense patrols, played a crucial role in the guerrilla demise. Upon Fujimori's resignation in 2000, a transitional government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that was created in 2001, because the power vacuum that Fujimori left in the country, and the work of the human rights organizations helped to contribute to the creation of the Truth Commissions in 2001, that in 2 years later, in 2003, the Truth Commission delivered its final report, and the result, the findings, is very astonishing that I'm going to show you in a moment in next slides. One thing I should say that the Truth Commission's main objective was to investigate what happened during these 20 years of civil war, the human rights abuses, who were the perpetrators, and how it happened. In many countries that experienced like civil war, military dictatorships, political violence, in order to return to democracy, in order to advance to peace and transitional democracy, we need a truth commissions that can make it clear and recognize what happened in this country, and so we can eventually reconcile it. So we had that experience, truth commissions, in most, mainly like with previous experience of truth commission, like in South Africa, and Southern Cone, like Argentina, Chile. So the work of the Truth Commission include collecting numerous testimonies, about 17,000 testimonies collected in different communities across the Andes, the Amazon, and the coast, and the coastal cities. And also, they conducted mass grave exhumations, because most people who disappeared, the time disappeared, had been buried like in mass graves in different places, mainly in Ayacucho, which was the epicenter of the conflict. And also the public hearing, where some victim survivors who can give their testimony to televised public hearing for the very first time to dignify and break the silence and share their own experiences, what really happened. So as you can see here in these slides, the main conclusions of the Truth Commissions, and it's very astonishing. The first, it estimated that almost 70,000 people were killed or disappeared, resulting to the conflict, mainly poor, rural, and Quechua-speaking people. It's about 75% were people who killed or disappeared speak Quechua or any other indigenous language. And over 40% of the victims were from Ayacucho, the birthplace of the Shining Path. Also the region where I come from, and I grew up in the middle of this conflict. And of course, I witnessed what happened during these tragic years, and that influenced tremendously my own academic career as a human, as a person, as a civilian as well. The Truth Commission also concludes that the Shining Path was responsible for over half the killings, and the government security forces for over a third, while the remaining dead were victims of local militias or MRTA rebels. This is the highest level of guerrilla culpability for violence found by any Truth Commission report for any of Latin America's Cold War era conflicts. Shining Path took distance from other more traditional guerrilla movements from that era. At the time of the Truth Commission's work, rural and urban migrants self-taught musicians, many victims themselves or who lost their relatives, especially from the conflict epicenter region of Ayacucho, gave their testimonies through music performances, often naming their songs as a canciones testimoniales, testimonial songs. These musicians embodied their wartime experiences and positioned themselves and their people as victims of brutal violence and massacres committed by the Shining Path and the state security forces. A particular indigenous music is called pumpin, pronounced pumpin, and I will perform. I'm give you a little demonstration at the end of my talk. I bring my guitar so you can hear, this a little bit about this music. Pumpin is a Quechua carnivalesque and testimonial music genre and dance performance from the province of Fajardo, Ayacucho, often played with 12-string guitars and sung in Quechua and or Spanish. In February 2002, a musical ensemble, Conjunto Musical, is the name in Spanish, called Siwar Gente de Huancapi, performed the song titled Fosas Clandestinas, Clandestine Graves, during the annual Carnival Festival in the highland plateau called Huashuanto. As you see in this image, it's located very high, over 4,000 meters in highland Ayacucho in the province of Fajardo, where musicians, local musicians and people, and also migrants and displaced people from urban centers go back to this contest, this festival, and to perform and bring their own songs. Very testimonial songs, and kind of, if you are familiar, like the corridos from Mexico's northern musical genre. So it's giving some stories, giving some narrative about history. The carnival contest in Huashuanto, particularly in this place called Huashuanto Plateau, started before the Shining Path insurgency. Indigenous young people from the nearby towns surrounding the Huashuanto mountain held informal pumpin gatherings until the mid-1970s. In these meetings, participants improvised their songs about love, play, and satire. As ethnomusicologist Jonathan Ritter, who studied the evolution of this music, said, quote, "The internal logic of this event on Huashuanto centered on courtship and inter-community competitions, principally among young men and women. Songs, texts were at best secondary concerns." So most of this performance and songs were talking about more the traditional communities' practices and love experiences, right? However, I'm gonna just explain briefly. I think while I'm reading, sometimes I feel like I'm going very slowly. That's what happened later when the Shining Path started its armed struggle and campaigning, for revolutionary armed struggle. So they became gaining local support, recruiting combatants, but using this indigenous music that, which is normally, singing and in Quechua, and they changed the lyrics of this language with revolutionary contents, with social and political content, in order to, influence their political ideology and political campaign or propaganda for the revolutionary cause. And in the early 1980s, 1980, 1981, when this contest was still active, Shining Path sympathizers and militants organized some musical groups, and they performed in the stage and calling for revolutions. For example, one of these musical group called Sirinitas de Huashuanto performed a song called International Situation, and revolutionary situations which are subject of clear Maoist tendency. and I'm gonna skip this part. And you can see here the lyrics. It's very, very political, very highly revolutionary, message that they are spreading at these early years of the Shining Path insurgency, with clear message about the the poor, the poverty, and the social injustice, and that worker and peasants are joining to bands with this popular war in order to overcome the misery and the poverty and the social justice. So the militants used the rhythm of a structure of pumping as a traditional music and changed the lyrics with revolutionary message. However, except for the music director of, for example, of this group, Sirenitas de Guasuanta, not all the members of Sirenitas were active members or clear sympathizers of the Shining Path, according some testimonies. The group's popularity, at least at the beginning, arose not so much because of their political speech, but by the strength of their performances and the vocal power of their teenage singers. In 1982, for example, when the police intervened in this stage of Guasuanto, the contest was postponed because they were singing, this revolutionary message, and that's associated, of course, with the Shining Path, and so the intervention of the police and the military ended up this contest, this festivities, and it was postponed until late 1990s. And in the late 1990s, those who survived, musicians, singers, activists, began organizing again, to bring the festivity, the contest, the carnival contest to this place again. And especially between 2001 2002, as I said, at the time, the Truth Commission was working, with several teams, collecting testimonies in communities, and of course, people were afraid. I mean, they knew that the Truth Commission was arriving to their communities. So some people, musicians, become performing about what happened during that year, telling stories about the military repressions, the massacres, the mass graves, as in these songs collected by my colleague, ethnomusicologist Jonathan Ritter, show. I don't know if this can a little bit, and you can see also the musical style of pumping music and dance, and there is a subtitle in English, and you can a little bit get a sense of what they are talking about, or what they are performing. So it has this musicians, male musicians playing this 12-string guitar, and women mainly dancing and also singing. Um, and it's very powerful how this space became a place of memory where these musicians and the audience can remember and denounce what really happened, and also telling story about their positionality, right, as a musicians. And back to the early 1980s, this was very political performance at the time. As I said, as I show you the previous revolutionary songs by the Shining Path. But in the aftermath of this conflict, this contest, this carnival festival became the main space for commemoration and social memory of the locals during and after years of violence. This is more like in rural area, right? Moving to the urban centers, for example, I'm going to show you this other image. Also in Ayacucho, because the other slides also, the music is coming from Ayacucho, and in urban centers, Ayacuchano musicians, such as Manuel Chaprado and Carlos Falconi, denounced the brutality of the war through their songs. They call their music Canción Social Ayacuchana, the social songs from Ayacucho. And in the late 1980s, they released these two musicians, very prominent and activist musicians, who survived the war because they are from this northern and southern Ayacucho regions. They call their music, of course, as I say, Canción Social Ayacuchana, and in the late 1980s, they released this cassette, as you see the cover, Testimonio Ayacuchano, this testimony of Ayacucho, which include their songs with socio-political testimonial content. As Carlos Falconi, one of these guitarists and singer-composer who passed away last year, said, unquote, "Music was the only space we had to talk about the terrible things happening in our lives," unquote. In songs such as Viva la Patria, Falconi denounced the brutality of the state repression and sexual abuse of women by soldiers and army officers. This is kind of, giving you briefly background, historical, but also from the lens of music, how music was, having this important role in documenting, narrating in more creative way what was happening at this difficult time in this war zone in rural regions like Ayacucho, the epicenter of the conflict. But moving now to the present, and I'm gonna bring more, this global music. We're talking about that so far is more local, regional music, it's Andean, indigenous musical genre. But now, moving to this present, we see a new generations. Some of them will grow up in the aftermath of this conflict, and few probably they grew up as myself, in the middle of this conflict as a child. But everyone, that these three musicians and singers that I'm going to present, Liberato Cani, Renata Flores, and Edith Ramos, they're very young people from these three regions, cities where the massacres happened. Liberato Cani is from Andahuaylas, Apurímac. Renata Flores, a rapper and hip-hop singer also, she's from Ayacucho, and Edith Ramos from Southern Punos, Juliaca. So, musicians, at this time of the protest, going back when I started my talk, responded to the state violence and military repression with the same tradition of denouncing the human rights abuses and against the impunity. These are new generation of young people who were born in the aftermath of violence, and they are well informed about what happened in the 1980s and 1990s. Since the demonstration erupted in December 2022, dozens of music artists have composed protest songs calling for the end to Boluarte's government and condemning the death of at least 47 people who have been killed. From hip-hop to huayno, the popular musical genre in Peru, through reggae and punk, the spiral of protests in which Peru is immersed has inspired songs of all styles that put lyrical to the discontent of those who raise their voices against the political elite, racism, and police and military repressions. Over hip-hop music, young Quechua rapper Liberato Cani responds to the first massacre in Andahuaylas, where he teaches history at the high school. He spent his childhood between Lima and Andahuaylas, and later he started rapping in Quechua as a way of language and cultural resistance to the state nation's dominant ideology of mestizaje that denied indigenous background. At the time of the protests, he was in Cusco, where he was studying for his master program in anthropology, when he received a call from his father that the police were killing demonstrators in Andahuaylas. One of his students was among the killings. His sister and father witnessed the massacre. Liberato Cani was angry at that moment and turned his emotion into a song writing almost entirely in Quechua. Tukui yachtakuna hatarisunchi. Let all our villages rise. His song talked about Lima's centralism and how indigenous peoples from the southern Peruvian Andes and the Amazon fight against an oppressive and corrupted system correlated with corporate media that lies to citizens. The song also called his people for resistance with the strength of their ancestry, the Incas and the Chancas, Aymaras and Ashaninkas, from the pre-Hispanic Tawantinsuyo Inca civilizations up to the present struggles, waging with legendary self-defense Inca weapon called Huaraca. Liberato songs also talk about how Peru's constitution, which was drawn up under Fujimori's regime, needs to be renewed, as you can read here. In the face of so much repressions due to the Constitution of '93, these constitutions legitimize neoliberalism. And like in Pinochet's Chile, a free market economy was imposed under an authoritarian regime. As a result of 30 years, this economic model just brought a more unequal and divided country as the COVID-19 pandemic revealed the collapse of the state and its healthcare and educational system. So the demonstrators claim for constitutional assembly that creates a new constitution with indigenous participation and gender parity to depatriarchalize and decolonize the state. Support for constitutional assembly in Peru increased during the mobilizations. Indigenous activists and protesters even talk about building a plurinational state, respecting indigenous rights and their non-human relatives in the Andean cosmovisions. Finally, Liberato's music reproaches representative democracy, a false democracy that enables passive citizens participating in polls to elect the same political and economic elites. As he said in his verses, don't you see that they want us to remain silent, spreading supposed democracy just a pure fallacy, deciding for the community without popular consultations, murderous laws they make and trash TV justify. Perhaps we can watch a little bit portion of this song in hip hop.
Hatariku sunji, nyau bah Bahman purispa purisunchik llaqta masillay hatarikusunchik tukuy llaqtakuna kaypi kanchik llaqta masillay hatarikusunchik Bahman purispa purisunchik llaqta masillay hatarikusunchik tukuy llaqtakuna kaypi kanchik kaypi ñuqayku kachkanchik tukuy llaqtakuna hanayman purispa kayta haparispa tukuy suyukunapi yarinanpaq yaw mana churikunki chay suwakunata sapawata suwawanchik kayta wakta ruwasaq nispa llullakuspa purimunku pensarantis kaykiwan mana ñan engañawanki warakaywan kaypi suyayki chankas incas aymara hashaninka tukuy ayllukuna hatarimuchkanchik pisipas qaña ñuqayku kachkanchik chay leyes nikiykuna hambraykulla chaymantataq ninki llaqtanchikrayku llamkanki ama sichiwaychu ñuqayku yachanikuña chay llullasqaykikuna manam ñawsayachiwasunchu kay takikuna tawantin suyumanta ñawpa hatun runakunapa kallpanwan llapanchik rishkarimuchkanchik kayta willaspa kayta rimaspa con el son llaqtamanta llaqtapaq solo con guaraca y megáfono para la plaza contra tu jangra sistema que no pasará porque esto es resistencia cultural llaqta masillay hatarikusunchik Bahman purispa purisunchik llaqta masillay hatarikusunchik tukuy llaqtakuna kaypi kanchik.
I mean, yes, continue and how long I have? Okay, thank you.
Like half an hour more.
Great, thank you. So I don't want to also make you tired, so I'm gonna just give. Well, we combine with some video clips, so that will be good, to have the sense of music and also kind of contextual approach, to this musical voice and expressions. So, okay. First of all, I'm gonna say a little bit more about Liberato and what the political elites, economic and military elites, think about those who are protesting, and especially about indigenous people. Political elites perceive indigenous and rural population as passive electoral voters, offering broken promises. They don't understand that indigenous peasants have their own political platform of a struggle based on communal consensus approved in the assembly. Community assembly is the most democratic institutions that prevails locally. This local institution has historically sustained peasant and indigenous mobilizations for their social and political rights based on their Andean knowledge system and cultural practices, including solidarity, reciprocity, and identity belonging to a community, territory, or ethnic nations. Rural and urban community members donated a little of their poor salaries, supplies, and resources to support the demonstrations, and their people who have to mobilize to Lima to make their voices listened to in protest against repressive regimes. And here's come Renata Flores, the other singer. Like a Liberato Cani, Renata Flores raised her voice through her hip-hop track from his native Ayacucho, where she and her family witnessed the December 10 massacre. She also criticized Peru's centralism, despising people living in provinces and criminalizing them when they go to protest. The indifference of Lima during internal armed conflict also repeated during the current protests and tragedy. So, what I want to say is, at the time of the Shining Path War in the 1980s, as I say, it started in Ayacucho and spread throughout the Andes. Those who were in Lima, mainly like elites, conservative sectors, they don't care much what was going on in the provinces because that's the backward Indians and suddenly later become a terrorist. Until when the Shining Path decided to move its guerrilla warfare from rural to urban centers. And in 1991, there was this bombing cars, in the center, in the vortex of this rich neighborhood called Miraflores. That's a massacre. It was car bombing that killed about dozens of people in the place called Tarata, and she mentioned in her song Tarata in this the song that she wrote. So, for those who are from Lima, at the time of the conflict, didn't matter for Limeños until they experienced the Shanenbat attack like in Tarata, at the center of Lima's wealthy neighborhood, as I said. However, Ayacucho's people experienced it, as Renata said, hundreds of Taratas. And it's very powerful word how she is making comparison, the indifference of those who are living like a more privileged way, and they didn't say anything, instead of condemning, just following this common sense of, these people are terrorists, criminals, and protesting because they don't have to work or they don't have to do anything to say. So, as he said, in the name of my people, who for 20 years have suffered hundreds of taratas, thousands of deaths and missing persons. This is the part that I really, engage. This is very powerful words, and we were going to listen in a moment. Her songs. Renata then voices about the silence of both those victims who could not speak by themselves before being killed, and as the white indifference, the silence of those who condemn those victims without evidence and trampling their rights to protest. She continues rapping, saying, that voice of the mother of the Andes that asks for justice and never gives up, about the struggles of indigenous Quechua women who lost their husbands and children during the conflict, and many of them were detained and took to the Ayacucho's military base. We're talking about the time of the conflict, 1980-1990s. This place called, the military base called Los Cabitos, where soldiers, officers detained, to suspect or linked to terrorist actions. And some of them are innocent. They don't have to see it. They don't have to, they didn't have any connection to this movement. But because they are Indians, they are indigenous, or they are just suspect, and they have been detained and put in prisons or military detained base, and then disappeared, and even buried like mass graves or cremated. There was this for cremations in this military base in Ayacucho. And I'm saying, and as a historian, that's really exists, and we can see this oven where they have been cremating these detainees. And one of these organizations, one of the first human rights organizations, was called ANFACEP, Asociación de Familiares de Detenidos Secuestrados Desaparecidos. It's a long name of this first female widows, Quechua speakers, who were organizing and searching for their disappeared loved ones, like children, husbands. And they became, into the public, because traditionally in a patriarchal society, very machista, society, like in the Andean regions. So women are, the role of women also is just, for domestic labor, right? But the conflict changed because they lost their loved ones. They have to, come to the public and search for the disappeared. And these women that Renata's songs are, kind of giving homage and recognition of these Quechua indigenous women that are struggling, for justice. And now, how this violence from that era is still reactivated, because there's continuity of state violence and the massacres that happened recently in Ayacucho. These women are very indigenous, Quechua speaker. If you compare with other women's organizations from the era of the conflicts and military dictatorship, like in Southern Cone in Argentina, the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, for example, so they were very much educated. They are urban educated, mothers and abuelas, right? But in this case, in Ayacucho, these women were they are monolingual, some of them Quechua speak. I didn't know much, about, how to deal with these human rights abuses, where to go, searching for support. And so they struggle a lot, face several, challenges, and in order to, bring its organizations, to survive and struggle for justice, truth, and memory. So ANFACEP, as I say, this women's organization, the first human rights organization, was founded in 1983. Finally, like Liberato Cani, Renata called for questioning the democracy. As you see in this part of this verse, that's highlighted in yellow, why do you boast about a democracy that excludes, represses, and discriminates? It always comes only when you cast your vote. You complain, they silence you. They leave and become the vote. That democracy is the corruptions that reach everywhere. You should never normalize it. You should always question it. This is the girl that has very powerful and become very influential, like your age probably. She has now 22, but when she became an artist and started singing more like Michael Jackson's covers and in Quechua, and that was when she was 17 years old, and she is very popular now in the country, globally. So let's listen part of her songs, and it's very powerful, and I really like because it started with this Andean, very rich sound, and this voice in Quechua that talking about her family, her grandma and mother who experiences the civil war and how they survive, and the continuity of this violence, right?
Jamie hanach pa chakunawahan chairi pushaiki manta. Jamie hanach pa chakunawahan chairi pushaiki manta. Te hablo desde mi tierra, majestuoso Ande, imponente azul del cielo. Aquí los sapos nos protegen, nos abrigan en la América que se olvida. En nombre de mis abuelos que muchas oportunidades no tuvieron. En medio de la guerra surgieron, ya mis padres protegieron. En nombre de mi pueblo que 20 años han sufrido. Cientos de taratas, miles de muertes y desaparecidos. Ñahuita Hawel, Kaitakipi, Nizhaikichik. Kanchi, Kiki Harawi Kanchi, Kai Pachapi Kachkanchi, Achikiaita Maskasunchi, Kaya Warya Kanchi, Kiki Harawi Kanchi, Kai Pachapi Kachkanchi, Achikiaita Maskasunchi. La impotencia, olvido, dolor y rabia pasaron por mis venas. Es momento de hacer escuchar lo que se quiere callar. El silencio de los que sin poder defenderse partieron, de los que no tienen privilegios. El silencio de los que condenan sin pruebas y pisotean sus derechos. Esa voz de la madre del Ande que pide justicia y jamás se rinde. Kunan mi nimpa, causa inimpi hinakui. ¿Por qué te jactas de una democracia que excluye, reprime y discrimina? Siempre llega solo al emitir el voto. Reclamas, te silencian, se van y los vuelven devotos. Esa democracia es la corrupción que a todos lados llega. Nunca debes normalizar, siempre debes cuestionar. Kai Pachapi Kachkanchi, Achikiaita Maskasunchi, Kaya Warya Kanchi, Kiki Harawi Kanchi, Kai Pachapi Kachkanchi, Achikiaita Maskasunchi. Nos ensañan con los hijos del Ande, tierra de quechuas de gran sabiduría, y aymaras de bruñido bronce. Costa, sierra, selva, trabajemos mostrando toda nuestra grandeza. Nuestra diversidad es nuestra riqueza. Se llegará el tiempo que saldremos de esta.
Well, and the last musicians is a traditional music singer named Edith Ramos, a native of Ayaviri in Puno, a Quechua and Aymara lyrical soprano. She sings in trilingual Quechua, Aymara, Spanish languages. Proud of her Andean traditional cultural heritage, as she said in an interview, quote, "I'm not a rescuer," someone who rescue like collected like traditional songs. I make music that exists, that has life, and that doesn't deserve to be dead or forgotten. Because it is the effort of our ancestors. It is the struggle of the migrants who arrived in Lima in the 1940s and whose moths were shot. They arrived with the shame of being Quechua speaking or Aymara. That music doesn't have to die. And it's very interesting how these musicians, Liberato Cani, Renata Flores, and Edith Ramos, are very proud of their ancestry. They are very proud of their cultural heritage, their language, the indigenous language that they use, Quechua and Aymara, right? While other young people feel shame to express their own indigeneity or in their own indigenous identity because racism, because this ideology of mestizaje that deny indigenous or indigeneity. So it's very complex ethnic relationship that bring just pure and homogeneous way of being Peruvian, patriotic, and one single Spanish speaker, and we have very diverse indigenous languages and cultures. Edith Ramos experienced closely the police repression during the protests that killed about 18 indigenous civilians in the southern city of Juliaca, Puno. A month after the massacre, she sings during the mass at the church to commemorate the victims. As you see here, the lyrics. Let them shout their indignations. What are they looking for by silencing them? What are you looking for by bleeding them? What are you looking for by breaking them? And she says in Quechua, Amapuni wawanchistaja hon hasuncho, yapachisi suyarisun. Amapuni wawanchistaja hon hasuncho, yapayanchismi suyarisun. Let us never forget our children who died. Together we will always rise. The verses in Spanish and Quechua resonated with the most brutal massacre that happened in Juliaca. Let's listen. And it's very powerful and very, touch my, I'm sure it's going to touch your heart also. It's very powerful how she's singing in this church, giving homage to the victims.
Que canta el pueblo su dolor, deja que lloren a sus muertos, deja que griten su indignación. Que canta el pueblo su dolor, deja que lloren a sus muertos, deja que griten su indignación. Que buscas con acallarlo, que buscas con desangrarlo, que buscas con desunirlo. Que buscas con acallarlo, que buscas con desangrarlo, que buscas con desunirlo. Amapuni wawanchista con jasun, chuya payanchis misayarisun. Amapuni wawanchista con jasun, chuya payanchis misayarisun, ya payanchis misayarisun.
All these musicians, and I'm going to conclude, all these musicians produce their voices through traditional and global music from the vortex of this protest. Edith Ramos from Juliaca, Renata Flores from Ayacucho, Liberato Cani from Andahuaylas. They made clear music from the provinces and the Andean traditions, which broke the pattern of Lima as the leading producer of mainstream music. Of course, Lima's music industry center also expressed their positionality during the protests by gathering their musicians to call for peace and, quote, future of Peru and our children, unquote. As one of musicians by the name Pelo de Ambrosio sings, quote, I am proud to be Peruvian and I do not want more violence in our streets, unquote. But at the same time, these white limeño musicians silence the human rights abuses and promote in some way impunity for those perpetrators. Like hip-hop music, Andean music, and the Quechua language itself have a political resistance history. For years, the Andean people of Peru have faced linguistic and racial discrimination for speaking their native language, with some of the most violent oppression happening in the 1980s and 1990s. During this time, many indigenous groups were tortured and accused of being part of the Shining Path guerrilla groups, simply for speaking Quechua or because they or were Indians and linked to the backward and terrorism. As time has progressed, the imagination and ideologies toward indigenous peoples in Peru have improved nothing or little. To this day, many who speak Quechua, Aymara, or other indigenous languages with these indigenous accents still grapple with racism and discriminations. In this context, music was also a battle space for resistance and political positionality, building solidarity networks among indigenous, Aymara, and Quechua communities between rural and urban descendants, especially during the so-called La Toma de Lima. Then the music protest facilitated to spread the solidarity beyond their physical context toward national and international audiences. I will end my talk with this video clip of Sicuri musicians that homage to those people killed in Juliaca. Sicuri is a musical style from Peru and Bolivia, consisting of siku players and drum accompaniment. The video shows various groups of sicuris who, through their music, express their solidarity with the victims and relatives of their oppression carried out by government, and their music bears say, the day I die, I may the sicuris not be missing. Dying fighting for our country, seeing so much injustice. Quechuas and Aymaras always fighting together. I think we can end it here, and I'm very open to talk with you and respond to your comments or questions.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. People should feel free to raise their hands. Comments?
Come on, don't be shy. Yes, please go
I
ahead.
don't have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for teaching us about the struggle today. I never had the opportunity to learn about this in school, but when I heard the protest songs for the first time today, I felt the emotions of the citizens who made them, and it really touched my heart. So thank you so much, sir.
No, thank you for coming and listening to, and I'm very glad that I could share with you some of my own connection with my own culture also
I
and
made
music.
a lot of different notes, especially of the different artists who you showed us, and I plan to do more research on them later. So I'm very glad I could come to this presentation.
Yeah, thank you. They're very influencer persons. You can follow them and their music. Very popular, and I mean they have this conscious about who they are. Right? They are not just coming to embrace easily this global music and for the commercial or industrial way of consuming music. Right? They are using the music to express their own resistance and criticize the racism, state violence. That's very powerful. I mean, young generations are doing that and changing the mentality of other young generations and the future. It's huge. I mean, I feel proud myself being Quechua speaker that these people are changing the world, changing the generations that have been shamed, that have been racialized for speaking the native languages in urban centers. Right? Thank you.
Thank you.
How about you first, and then?
Hi. So I feel like I have some questions. I feel like I can have an unfair advantage because I'm also Peruvian. At least I consider myself to be. I lived in Lima since 13 until basically recently. Coming from Lima, my family's actually from Argentina. I was born there, but again, as I said before, coming from Lima specifically, I kind of grew in what I call like the Pituco bubble,
Right.
which is like anything that happens outside of Lima. Is that even Peru? Question mark. And kind of the question that I have is, at least seeing my friends and seeing their families, even no matter kind of the class or the background, in Lima I feel like there's such a fear to even talk about to even talk about what those years were like.
Right.
Outside, the problem with this question, I feel like it's either an easy answer or you just talk about it for hours and hours, but I noticed that in the interior of the country, there's not so much this fear to talk about it, or at least not a fear of saying like this is something that happened, while the Limeño just wants to like, let's just forget about it.
Right.
Which obviously creates this like complex problem, which is like, so the Luminoso comes from this like aislamiento social
Right.
of like people in the interior, and of course we just end up like in the same spot that we started.
Right.
Do you think that there's a form for like Peru as a whole, but specifically for Lima, to break this sort of like social taboo and the stigma? I consider in my generation, I see it happen way more with my friends.
Right.
But I feel like it like outside of that obvious shift, how do you think we can consciously kind of start to like
Right.
look to areas where like, no, we need to talk about what happened, basically.
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, I'm very optimistic, and I think the young people are very in charge to change this. What our parents and grandparents didn't want to recognize, that we are living in a country and a diverse ethnic, linguistic differences, and that we can come together, in some way, to build a better, more respectful relationship between us, between Peruvians. But recognizing, I think first of all we have to recognize what we are in the past, and we have to be conscious that you respectful and not forget what this narrative that doesn't help us, about this white and black perspective, right? These two, this polarized visions that doesn't help us. We have to recognize who we are in the past and how, between our brothers and sisters, implicated. We involved in this past civil war, and we have certain responsibility, even that we are just civilians, right? With our silence, with the indifferences. All these are, something that we have to, recognize and ask ourselves what we can do in order to continue and change this. That future generations, our children, can grow up in a more better, equalitarian society, that they can respect and learn each other. Just besides just folklorizing, I always see that those who are elites and conservative, they are proud of the past Inca society, right? They're proud of this Machu Picchu. They're proud of the diversity of food, but they also despise it, and those people, indigenous people, who are bringing off and sustaining this culture. So that's not being respectful about whether you have this diversity of people. There are people who are surviving and struggling. And as you say, for some people, like in Ayacucho, violence is everyday life because they are part of their memory. Ayacucho has been militarized and devastated. And so they live with that trauma. And for those who didn't experience it, or experience more like peripherally, so it's of course not the same. It's they don't want to see the part, they don't want to debate, they don't want to talk about, and they pass the page, right? So, forget, and that's promoting silence, and you are not recognizing what's really happening in order to bring new dialogue and debate, right? And children have, of course, learned about it. It's really hard. Well, thank you. I think you have questions.
Yeah, I think part of what he said answers part of my question. I was curious. I was just kind of like trying to wrap around the context because I'm like just trying to figure out like why what was kind of separating people from like I guess the rural and the urban areas from kind of further understanding it. But his question kind of makes me understand that a little better. So I have like a few comments, I guess, but one being that I'm curious, like, what exactly about the universities and the education system was seen as criminal, especially because I think it is interesting, like, if there's a split between urban and rural areas, it seems like the colleges would be in urban areas.
Right.
So I'm curious about like how that dynamic works. And one observation that to me is sad and interesting is like in the beginning you talked about how that native art and music was used in like a cultural, like in a community setting and a community competition, and it was kind of about love and it was about storytelling and then people come along and sort of pervert it to be about revolution. And I think it becomes a common story about any type of art form. But it is kind of sad that happened. And the last thing I'll say is it reminds me a lot of, like, I guess helping me contextualize. I'm Puerto Rican, and I've learned a little bit about, and I still need to learn more, but about the struggle of the Taino people, and just even growing up, like my family, like parents got divorced. My father's side is more African, Puerto Rican, and Taino. My mom's side is kind of more Spaniard or white, I guess. So there's always kind of a question of a separation between like the white Puerto Ricans and the darker Puerto Ricans or the Taino people. And so it helps me contextualize it now.
Right.
There's such a clear otherness, so I can see how that plays into it.
Yeah. I didn't talk about, but this concept that some scholars call like racialization of geography, how geographies and spaces are very isolated sometimes, and I think that's really happening. I mean, in Peru and everywhere, that when certain people consider that certain areas or regions or provinces, like as unmodern or pre-modern or uncivilized or Indians, and of course. That division and exclusions created more disparities, social disparities, and less opportunity, of course, for those people who live in these marginalized sectors and areas. And education is a good point to analyze, how, how exclusive it's, education can be, opportunities can be for those who have access in urban centers, for basic education, like mainly in Lima. But those who are in rural areas, provinces, they have to fight, for opportunity. First of all, to move to urban centers and be able, to access. And I can say many things about from my own history, as child growing up in this rural, isolated community in the vortex of this conflict and having this opportunity, to, struggle, for going to high school and then to the university. And it's a tremendous responsibility for those who come from unprivileged sectors, because we have this commitment, to our family, our community, our people. It's not just because you have to, this individual way of thinking that, oh, I want to be someone, I want to be an artist, I want to be, filmmaker or whatever, but this is my own, the development, in order to get a degree, a job, etc., right? But for those who come from, these unprivileged sectors and, and being more conscious like me, so we struggle, it's a commitment, getting a PhD is not just a degree, it's a struggle, that we have to contribute to our community, that we have to, we belong to certain community, nations, ethnic groups, that we have to work for them, and that's what I'm doing. As I spent like 10 years in the United States, and now I go back to my country to teach, students and learn from them and helping musicians like this and visualize in academia, because they have been struggling in different areas, but also the opportunity that other people that follow like me, there are many kids, waiting for opportunities that they can follow my purpose, that they can have this chance, to go to the educations and to have some education and we, support the family. That's what we do, and I think. But it's more commitment than the state or this policy is not going to help you much, because they don't invest much in education. They invest more like in armed forces for security or police, repression, buying all these weapons to repress protesters or demonstrators, and we haven't seen that in the country, in this current government. But thank you very much for the question. Yes, please.
Just a comment for what you said about specifically the governments, because I feel like Argentina is the same, of spending more money into military and police instead of education. Specifically what happened in Peru recently with the, I can't remember the name right now, but the clause that wants to or the project that was presented in Congress to cut funding from cinema.
Right.
I remember seeing so many comments saying, oh, it's fine, they're cutting away from cinema, they should use that money to create jobs. And all I could think of was, what do you think the money was for? Because,
right.
And I don't know, just commenting on that, where it's this idea, I feel like we're the populace at large, because the same thing happens in Argentina, where it's any sort of money you spend in education or cinema, they're it's they think of it as this idle pursuits. And I also wonder why do people ignore this money also creates jobs? It also brings
right.
forward the country.
Yeah.
I don't know, sorry, I'm just saying
No, I think it's perfect comment. I mean, because these initiatives, from kind of indigenous cinematography, are bringing not only this, a different perspective, they are bringing a knowledge. They're bringing a cultural practice and knowledge system, how these indigenous peoples want to represent themselves, their own knowledge systems that can dialogue with this Western perspective, right? And it's a recognition, right? It's a visibilization that can bring, more rich and more united country with, having this diverse, different perspectives, right? And yeah, we can continue with talking about these issues, but this is something that's currently going on. So. Yes, please.
Do you feel supported at your university in terms of the message that you're sharing? And second, in the 10 years that you were here, living in many university communities, did you feel that among the people around you that there was also this, for example, the artists that you shared, that there's this pride that's growing?
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel among indigenous people who have migrated to the United States from Latin America, do you feel that they're shifting into a consciousness in this similar way?
Oh, thank you very much for the questions. And it's hard to talk about for myself, as my journey has been very difficult also. As a child growing up in in rural area and then later in urban centers, I feel, very much the racism and linguistic discriminations, and I feel also shame of myself being Quechua and growing up in Lima in high school. So, but that changed when I get into the university, in a public university, very prestigious university, San Marcos Public University in Lima, where I could find also other people like me, and they are proud of themselves. And some of them maybe not recognized, but they are, children of displaced people, workers, laborers. So, and that's how I became, proud and conscious about, where I come from, where I am, as a child of indigenous peasants, migrants, and Quechua speakers. But I think more like intellectually, I developed my thinking in my graduate PhD programs in UC Davis in California, where it's a really important, one of the first department on Native American Studies, where I took several classes, seminars on indigenous studies. And my classmates were more like northern, indigenous scholars, students, and I learned a lot. These different basic, concepts and indigenous perspectives that I became proud of them and then incorporated in my research. That can, bring more rich interpretation, rich reflections on Peru's history, recent Peru's history, and how, problematic is, talk about indigeneity in Peru. Here, I'm very free to talk about that. But in Peru, it can be hard. You talk about you mentioned about the university where I'm teaching now. There is not, there is no much space to talk about indigeneity or even racism. So, and there is not part of the curriculum, courses like about racism or anti-indigenous racism or indigenous perspective. But I'm there, to bring all this, knowledge and theoretical and methodological approach from indigenous perspective that can, offer, a different perspective also for those students who are coming also from provinces, from successful families who can send their children to these private universities and they can have change, and that I can open a space for them, in my class, in my seminars, or organizing events, and like you guys have here, and that's I really appreciate that, and that's something that I'm working. Thank you for your question. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm from Colombia, and I'm very happy to have come tonight. I know that following your intelligence and musical gifts earn you the privilege to be in the United States and study here. And I was very curious about how you got this support. How do you get to be an academic here, especially since you said you have been here 10 years. I feel that sometimes the educational opportunities for people from Latin America are very limited in the country, and also chance of going abroad is even harder. So I was wondering how you got this chance to be here.
Yeah. I think most of students coming from Latin America is where they have always this cultural shock, right? The first contact and the first months and year. So I had that, and but also as an Andean indigenous scholar, I always I come from a community and belong to a certain community, and wherever I go, I build a community. I engage, I search for community, a network. And that's what I have been doing, and that's how I survive in this country. So I did the same in Mexico City, where I studied also a master program in anthropology, and in California, San Davis. I had a community of as I say, my classmates from indigenous backgrounds, more like Northern American indigenous backgrounds, and also friends, colleagues from Latin America, from the Andean regions. Had some classmates from Cusco. Some of you are going next year, and I had one of my professor, Zoila Mendoza, who teaches Quechua at UC Davis and Andean Knowledge. I was her TA, teaching assistant, and so we had this music group, Agin Kausai, Sumah Kausai, which kind of beautiful living, something like that. So we had this musical group, and we organized social musical occasions and performed several events. Because my friend from Cusco, she sings in Quechua. We had yesterday a presentation at NYU working group on racism, and Carmen Valdivia, and then she's professor now in Philadelphia, and Zoila Mendoza. So we have this space, and when I moved to New York, and of course this is a multi-ethnic city. It's like Latin America, all in one single city, and so you have the chance, to interact, connect with several communities. And I found this Quechua community here, a huge Quechua speakers, about 10,000 Quechua speakers live in this city, according to some statistics that I found, mainly from Ecuador and Bolivia. And we have also among some Quechua scholars, we are organizing this Quechua Alliance annual meeting that we, activists, academics, are involved to organize and recognize our, heritage and building a community, Quechua community diasporically, right? So and that's how I started, linking, connecting with, this Quechua Collective of New York, for example. It's an organization based in Brooklyn, founded by Peruvian Apulimeña migrant who immigrated to the United States in New York in the late 1970s, and she started teaching first Quechua, and then later she visited the New York Public Library, and she was looking for some book on Quechua. And since she didn't find any books in Quechua, so she decided to start writing storytellings and children's book, and then later she decided to teach Quechua. So if you are interested in Quechua, so you can take class with her and the group, the team that she's leading, the Quechua Collective of New York, name. But also at NYU, there's also a Quechua program teaching by Peruvian Cusqueño, Odi Gonzalez, Quechua professor, teaches Andean culture and society. And I found this community, among scholars, Andeanists, activists. So I feel like my experience here in the university was very successful in every level. So although I always struggle with English, that my mind works like double, sometimes triple. So, but I feel proud of sharing my own culture and knowledge. Where I come
from. Maybe speaking of that, you had mentioned you wanted to share just a little bit to finish us off.
Yeah, I can share kind of demonstration. I might borrow some of your chair, if possible. So I rescued this guitar because when I have to move to Lima in July, I left my guitar. So it's untuned, so I have to tune several times. And it's uncommon guitar. It's called Puro guitarra. It's Quechua word. Puro is Quechua word. Short neck, as you see. I'm explaining a bit how did I get to that. It has different tunes. We have just 2 persons in the world this kind of guitar. My maestro, guitarist from Ayacucho, he's very old now. When I was doing my field work in Huamanquiquia, a small community in Ayacucho, I met him, and he has this similar like this guitar, and it was made for a particular musical genre, not about pumping, but also he started playing pumping music, that I will show you. But different carnival genres, and so I started learning with him, and since I success, so he decided to make one for me, and so that's I got this guitar. His name is Abilio Soto Yupanqui. You can search in Google and YouTube, and he plays beautifully songs. Abilio Soto Yupanqui. Okay, so I'm gonna play this pumping music, and I'm trying to sing. I don't. For a while that I didn't sing actually, but I'll try. These songs, testimonial songs, which is in Quechua, and it's talking about a mother searching for the disappeared, and several places in Ayacucho, and going to the military base, going to the morgue. Is the morgue the name? Morgue. Thank you. And local authorities, offices, asking for their loved ones who disappeared. Okay.
What is the name of the song, sir?
Chincascuna. It's in Quechua, but that could be translated like the disappeared. Chincascuna. chuya baba yarika, manamatarini chuya chuya rika. Thank you very much.
Let's just give one more round of applause.
I just want to say, if you're coming to Peru, I will be very happy to welcome you. And although I am teaching in Lima, but often conduct my research in the highlands region of Ayacucho, Apurímac, and eventually in Cusco. So, following these young musicians who are, changing the world, and some of you are traveling next year. So please feel free to reach me out. Anything you wanna learn in advance. So I will be very happy to respond and help you with anything, including you, my friend. What's your name?
Tomás.
Tomás. Yeah, nos vemos en Lima o en Cusco. But thank you so much. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to the School of Visual Arts. I'm very happy that that we had these conversations and something that you can keep in your mind that from what I share with you today. Anything about politics, culture, music. Thank you. Thanks so much.